Realize this morning I forgot to remind you all we have class today, but y'all were on top of it, so I didn't need the word. Excellent job. Oh, yeah. Be right back. I have an emergency blazer in my office. I'm gonna grab it. Chilly in here. Yep. Yeah, so we'll probably finish these slides today. And then we have a couple activities. We might do one today, might do one Wednesday, we might do both Wednesday. Sometimes we kind of just see how far we get. That's why there's always a rate of days, but yeah, good question. Yep, so I have a set of slides for every chapter rather than every day, if that makes sense. So it sort of depends on how many questions y'all ask, things along those lines. When we do activities, how quickly we get through this. All that good stuff. So, hello, welcome to our day of laboring, even though it should be a day off. Thank you all for being here. I very much appreciate it. Yeah, I am going to try taking attendance this way. One of the things I don't remember if I told you all or not is I'm horrible with names. I apologize. It will take me several weeks to learn your names. I will mix up two people who don't look anything alike. I don't know what my brain does, but it does that. So also, as I go through your names, if I butcher it, please correct. My first name is pronounced Taryn, but I've been called Tarin or Tarin at different points in my life, and I know how much that grates, but I don't want to be that person. Alrighty, Destiny. Awesome. Diego. Okay. Manny. Maria. Jasmine. And it's still ad drops, so I think there's some people who might be moving in and out of classes. Sean. Please come on in. Sammy. Rita. Jordan. And Nyla. Kyle. Alexa. Joe. Maybe. Okay, is it Tisha or Taja? Oh, Tasha. Okay, I'm gonna write it out for Taj. Okay, that works too. Whatever you prefer. I write up phonetic stuff for myself, just so again, I'm not that person. I try really hard not to be. All right, Demir, is that right? Yeah. Awesome, thanks. Nathan. Sebastian. Okay. Connor. Michelle. My eyes kind of go to you, so I'm starting to learn where you sit. So that's helping me. Chandler. Casey. Brooklyn. And Gabby. Very cool. Awesome. Thank you, Gabby. And then Diego, right? Okay, awesome. I'm starting. I'm learning slowly but surely. All right, so I have a couple things today. One is an announcement some of you may or may not find exciting or helpful, but I assumed enough of you might need a little bit of cuteness in your life that I would make this very important announcement. We got a kitten. So this is Giza. She is now a member of our family. We picked her up yesterday. She's only 4 months old. And as you can see, she is totally making herself at home already, including on top of my reading. And this is Simba, our current cat. And this is about how he feels right now, I think. So we are introducing them slowly, but in the middle of the night last night, he figured out something was going on and he was like scratching at the door. So if you hear me talk about Giza, that's why. So if folks aren't familiar from The Lion King, Simba means lion in Swahili. And so we named Giza because that means Black Panther in Swahili. So their name's kind of coordinated. She didn't seem like a Nala to me. So the next thing I am gonna try today and see how it goes. And if we hate it, we don't have to do it again. But I thought that, psychology is often in the news, right? And it's often portrayed in very cutesy or not demure, right? Cutesy. Or like pop culture-y ways. It's not always that accurate. And so one of the things that I'm on a challenge myself to do, and then hopefully this can get discussions going for us, is to, for every chapter we're covering, find at least one instance of that topic being discussed in the news, and we can talk about it. So for those of you who are following along on Blackboard, this is posted there. You can open the article. You don't have to. I made a new psychology in the news subfolder. I'm going to click into it in just a second. So as you all know, on Friday, I went over this whole thing about how Wilhelm Wundt was the first psychology lab in the 1800s. And then I saw this article, and it's like, I might have just lied to them. I didn't lie on purpose, right? But there is now an argument that we should say psychology started an entire century before that. Which then, like, my whole psychology is a very young science suddenly becomes maybe not as accurate, right? So it's really interesting to think about. So basically in Germany around this time, they hired some guys in their philosophy department who started incorporating some of the same stuff Wilhelm Wundt incorporated. So Habecourt taught psychology as part of his classes on metaphysics. And then there was another guy, Eberwasser maybe, who just talked about psychology separately. He said that psychology should be a science of its own. He worked with the university to change his title. This is a big deal, right? Like, I was hired as professor of psychology or assistant professor of psychology. I'm now a full professor of psychology. I also teach in the gender, women, and sexuality studies department, but that's not indicated in my title, right? This guy got them to change it. So instead of being professor of philosophy, he became professor of empirical psychology and logic. And he published the first textbook on psychology. Introduction to the regular study of empirical psychology for candidates of philosophy at his particular university. So I'm just going to click into this. This was the most exciting, if you call it that, I don't know, part of the article. You know, this goes into more detail if anyone's interested and wants to go look at it. He gave lecture, Wilhelm Wundt gave his lectures in the 1860s, 1870s, but these people are arguing, well, other stuff was going on. So basically, it took about 100 years after that book that we just talked about was published to establish a foothold in the system of the sciences. So sometimes what happens when academics in particular publish, although this can happen to anybody who publishes a book, is it just kind of sits there. And like maybe 3 people will read it, unfortunately, right? Sometimes it takes off and it's a big hit. And sometimes, it'll sit there for 100 years before someone finds it and is like, oh, this is cool, we should use it. So I thought this was a really interesting take on this, and this was just published. This was actually published in 2018, but it was one of the more recent changes to the history of psychology. So thinking about that, what are your reactions to the idea that we could be totally inaccurate? And here's maybe another example of something that got published and people aren't reading, because until I Googled, Google News searched history of psychology, I didn't know this thing had been published and it was 6 years ago, right? So what are your reactions to the fact that we're making discoveries that our science might be 100 years older than we think it is? Well, let's couch it in the second one. Why is history constantly changing if it already happened? And this is obviously not just the history of psychology, but history in general.
They find out more information all the time.
Exactly. So yeah, maybe someone dug up this book and was like, oh, this was published a while ago, huh? Yeah. So just like psychologists, historians do research. Their research is less giving people questionnaires and more digging in archives and places, right? So that can be part of it. What are some other reasons that history might change? Yeah.
Like, some people are too afraid, they may know information, but too afraid to say it.
Yeah, yeah, and that happened for years, right? Where especially women or people of color would publish stuff. And it would just be overlooked, or someone else would like take credit for their work, right? And then that person would be too afraid to speak up because they still needed a job to pay the bills. Yeah, that can definitely happen. Sometimes we try to brush stuff under the rug. So psychology, very recently, I believe it was 2 years ago, just came out and formally apologized for their history of racism. The American Psychological Association published a formal apology, a timeline of all the ways we screwed up. Sometimes maliciously, right? Sometimes just sort of like people being ignorant, but sometimes purposefully trying to make people of color look worse than white people. And for years we knew that stuff existed, but people just didn't want to talk about it, right? And now we're bringing it to light. And I think it helps that our CEO, Arthur Evans, of the American Psychological Association, is a Black man. And I believe when this came to light, our president was a Black woman, right? So someone who's not afraid to do that. So based on this, where do you all think we should say psychology exists? So who would say with Wilhelm Wundt in the 1800s? You can just raise your hand. How about who would now say the 1700s? All right, yeah. Would anyone say, now we should just go back to ancient times when people were trephining and stuff? They had an idea of psychology, right? That's kind of where I fall, I think, right? It's like, yeah, we formally mark when the field started, but we were doing psychology for centuries, maybe millennia, right? Yeah, so again, just something that I thought was pretty interesting, pretty different, and I'll try to find interesting stories like this. And as you can see, there might not always be like super up-to-date ones, but at least seeing stuff that comes up and how that might go. Alrighty. So as I mentioned, hang on just a sec, I'll get up our captions up here. So as I mentioned on Friday, we're going to start talking about structuralism versus functionalism, and this is a whole thing, so I wanted to cover it all together. And this is sometimes called the Battle of the Schools, and this wasn't actual physical schools, it was like schools of thought. And so these two intellectual schools of thought regarding the science of psychology fought it out. It's always like, that's not really an accurate term in most cases in the academic arena. But basically what they would do is they would publish stuff disagreeing with each other. Not very violent, maybe that's okay, right? And so you had Edward Titchener, whose picture is up here. He was in the structuralism corner, and then we will see his opponent, William James, who was in the functionalism corner on the next slide. So Titchener and the other structuralists believe that psychology should be about analyzing consciousness into its basic elements. So they wanted to model psychology on physics of the time. At that time, physicists were studying how matter was made up of basic particles. They were getting down to the idea of the atom, right? And what Titchener and the structuralists argued is this is what's important. We should be studying the structure of the mind and sort of how that influences what people do. To do this, they relied on a technique called introspection, which would be having a person come in and make careful, systematic self-observations of their own conscious experience. And in fact, oftentimes the structuralists started by just using themselves as the test subject. I can imagine there's some problems with this, right? You need people who are insightful. You need people who are verbal, right? It's not very reliable. So like, if I were to sit down and try to do this, and Edward Titchener was still alive and he sat down across the room from me and tried to do this, we might come up with totally different conclusions just because our lived experiences are so different. And depending on our neurodiversity and a whole host of other factors, we might actually visualize the world in different ways, right? So problematic, but this was one school. We should be studying the structure of the mind, getting it down to its atom or particle equivalents. William James was our functionalism guy. Now, William James is considered the founder of American psychology. So he was the first one, if you remember Wilhelm Wundt, especially with a name like that, right? He was over in Germany. The folks 100 years before were also in Germany. A lot of this was happening in Europe. William James was one of the first people to bring it back over to the US and say, hey, we should be studying psychology here too. So the functionalists thought the structuralists were completely missing the point. They said psychology should be about investigating the function or the purpose of consciousness, awareness, the mind, rather than its structure. This led to an investigation of mental testing. They also tried to look at developmental patterns over time. And even things like sex or gender differences. Now, James really interestingly, he's just an interesting guy in general. He was really influenced by Darwin, who was publishing around the same time. And he believed that thinking was adaptive, just like evolution was adaptive. And so the idea was that our thinking allows us to consider our past, use that in the context of our present circumstances to plan for our future. So you thought any thinking we do is going to be adaptive or in our best interests. Unfortunately, 150 years plus of psychology research has shown this is not always the case, right? Humans do not always act in their own best interest. We see this with self-destructive behaviors like abuse of substances, right? Reckless driving. Even something as simple as in my own field of study, I study social comparison to other people on the basis of your appearance, and then how that affects how you feel about yourself and your body. The original theory about social comparison said, if you are feeling bad after your comparison, you'll just stop. But in fact, when it comes to our appearance, and this is, we're finding more and more regardless of gender identity, you keep doing it. You keep comparing yourself to someone else, even if it's a supermodel you know, or an athlete you know is airbrushed, right? And photoshopped within an inch of their life. You keep doing it. So we know that people don't always do things in a way that is self-preservation, right? Sometimes stuff just gets in the way. William James also got a little bit into mesmerism, which was like seances and stuff like that. And there's a great series of letters from other psychologists being like, cut it out. We're trying to be a legit science and you are not helping. But you know, people gonna people. All right, so probably everybody here has heard of Sigmund Freud at some point or another, right? He's a big name. So he was actually what today we would call a psychiatrist. He was a physician. He went through med school. And we're gonna get to, at the end of these slides, probably on Wednesday, talking about what the differences between psychologists and psychiatrists are in more nuanced. But essentially, psychiatrists go through med school like any other physician. Psychologists go through grad school where they focus just on psychology. So he founded the psychoanalytic school of thought, which really was a theory that tried to explain everything about people. So he tried to explain human development, personality, why people develop psychopathology, death even, a whole host of things. And he didn't always do it in the most accurate way. let's be honest. Freud was influenced by his time and his circumstances. So one of the things that you probably heard about Freud, and we'll talk about this more later in the semester when we get to theories of personality, is he has this whole idea of like everything is because you're attracted to your mom. It's weird, right? Most of us were like, what? Huh? But Freud's mom was 20 years younger than Freud's dad, and by all accounts, she was very attractive. So it was sort of based on Freud's life circumstances. He also, I don't know how much this influenced things later in life, but he also experimented on himself, testing cocaine as an antidepressant. So, you know, who knows what that influenced, right? So his work with people with psychological problems led him to believe that there are unconscious forces in the mind. Things we don't even realize we're thinking, feeling, experiencing. There are memories back there we don't let ourselves remember. They're outside of conscious awareness. Now, one interesting thing about Freud is oftentimes you'll see people talk about the subconscious mind, right? Freud never used that term. When you translate his term, it was unconscious. So it wasn't just that it was like below consciousness. Freud believed it was totally outside of conscious awareness. He believed in particular that these unconscious conflicts and unconscious processes were related to sexual urges, or what he called psychosexual urges. And this was scandalous and offensive at the time. One of the primary ones, and again, think about this is in the 1800s, so you've got like the French Revolution, right? You've got a lot of countries really, and philosophers arguing for free will, things along those lines. And you can interpret Freud's theory as, okay, if we're influenced by forces we're not aware of, how do we have free will? How can we be in charge of our own minds? Secondly, this is the Victorian era. Okay, at this point in time, an ankle was scandalous. I've been to a historic home from this time in Columbia, South Carolina, and they had one of those divided staircases to go up to the front door, and they explained to us that was so that the women could walk down one side and the men could walk down the other, so the men would not be scandalized if they happened to see an ankle, right? And Freud's like, everything that happens is because of sex, when we don't even like show ankle, right? So this didn't really sit well in Vienna in this repressed time. Even a lot of Freud's like disciples, followers, students ended up kind of being like, you don't know about that sexual stuff. Kind of like distancing themselves from him. The controversial nature of Freud's idea caused great resistance to not only his ideas, but unfortunately also to the field of psychology and psychiatry. And his science were not really well received among academic circles, partially because Freud was just kind of coming up with this stuff. He wasn't testing it. He wasn't doing experiments. And if you remember, like the structuralists, the functionalists, they each have their own methodology. Right, Wilhelm Wundt is doing his own methodology. We're trying to say psychology is a science, and then this dude comes along and is like, I don't know, some unconscious stuff in sex. And everyone's like, but how? Right? And so it wasn't necessarily well received. Despite, or maybe partially because of this controversy, Freud's ideas moved into the mainstream. And these influenced thought in psychology, but also medicine, art, and literature in particular. A lot of his theories, like the uncanny valley, have influenced criticism within English literature, and even more so now with the rise of AI and CGI and film. The whole idea of the uncanny valley is used quite a bit, and some of his other ideas seem very relevant. Another really interesting thing about Freud is he trained specifically in hypnosis, because he wanted to help people, and at the time, they thought hypnosis was the best way to help people who were struggling mentally. And what he discovered is like, that worked sometimes, but it didn't seem like the hypnosis part was actually like magic in any way. It was the fact that once they were under hypnosis, people talked about their problems. And so what he did is he just took that idea. He's like, what if instead of like doing this whole like, woo, 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 I'm gonna hypnotize you, I just sat down and talked to somebody or put them on my couch as he did, right? And people would tell him things about their lives, about their dreams, and he would provide them with an interpretation of what was going on. And again, as I mentioned, the problems with his theories, really hard to do research to test something that's outside of conscious awareness. So what's really interesting about Freud is that a lot of what happened in the 1900s was theories coming about in reaction to Freud. People being like, I hate what this dude came up with, let me come up with something better. So again, even if you don't personally like Freud's theories, it's sort of interesting to think about how did he influence everybody else. So John Watson founded the Behaviorist School of Thought, and there were some other folks in the school with him, including B.F. Skinner, who we'll talk about in a couple different slides. So the basic tenet of behaviorism is we should only look at things we can physically observe with our eyes, our ears. So only observable behavior should be studied if we're going to be making psychology a science. And behavior, according to Watson, refers to an observable or overt response or just activity in general of an organism. And the reason I'm using the word organism is a lot of the behaviorists actually studied this in animals rather than in people. Watson actually did study it in people as well, but he and others did a lot of work with like pigeons and rats, things along those lines. These ideas radically changed the landscape of psychology. The idea like, oh, we can watch something and get some data from it, right? So psychology started becoming the scientific study of behavior. This was a radical reorientation from, the structure of the mind or unconsciousness within the mind to like, no, what can we see in front of us? And so people who were behaviorists were like, we don't need to talk about consciousness, who cares? Let's talk about what we can see. John Watson had really interesting perspectives on the nature-nurture debate. So this is the, are you born with everything you need to know, or do you learn everything? So he took a strong stand on this question. Are we who we are because of nature or because of nurture? He strongly argued for nurture. And while this quotation oversimplified his stance, his writings really contributed a strong environmental slant associated with the behavior school of thought. So he said, give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, and my own special world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take anyone at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select. Doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant, chief, and yes, even beggar, man, and thief. So what Watson was arguing, and again, this was novel at the time, is your destiny is not determined by where or when you're born or to whom. It is determined by the opportunities that you're given, right? Around the same time, we had educational psychology starting to form as a field, and they were starting to study some of this stuff as well and realize like, it's not that some kids were slow, as they used to call it back then, but that they, might have no access to books in the home, no access to parents who could sit down and read with them, things along those lines. John Watson, incidentally, also had really interesting ideas about parenthood. So at that time, they thought, oh, there's just a maternal instinct or a paternal instinct. When the baby's born, people just know what to do. And Watson actually went into like birthing wards and interviewed new parents, and he was like, they don't know anything. They have to figure it out, right? They have to learn it and teach themselves, which was radical at the time. And the behavioral school of thought in general was emphasizing that nurture, that environment, that sort of what you were exposed to, what you were allowed to learn or had the opportunity to learn was really going to determine things. This is always something that's controversial because people who are in power are often wealthy people who feel that they almost have like a divine influence that's given them this power and they deserve it, right? And to say, no, if you gave the kid who grew up in public housing the same opportunities you had, they'd be just as good, right? And they are just as good as a person. It's just the opportunities was radical and threatened those people in power. And you see some of this still today, unfortunately, with policies about let's not feed kids in schools, right? Even though all the science says they learn better and things along those lines. It just seems like human nature, right? You know, I pulled myself up on my bootstraps with a small loan of $1 million, right? Cool. If I had a small loan of $1 million, I could do lots of things, right? I'll probably never actually see $1 million in my lifetime in my bank account, right? I know I won't because I have like a mortgage and things like that. So really interesting to think about. B.F. Skinner was another behaviorist. Oh, and I should mention, but Watson and Skinner were American. This idea of behaviorism really was an American born theory. Skinner really, even more so than Watson, said we should only be looking at what we can observe. He didn't deny that mental events exist. He just said we can't be studied scientifically, and so who cares? He literally described the brain as a black box and said we can't study it, so we should only study sort of what happens to a being and how they react. He said anything that happens in the brain is outside, or the mind is outside the realm of psychology. Obviously, we disagree with that now, right? But it's an interesting theory, and again, an interesting reaction, kind of going to the other extreme from Freud's everything is in the unconscious mind, right? So the fundamentalist principle is that organisms tend to repeat responses, or sorry, the fundamental, not fundamentalists. Skinner's fundamental principle is that organisms, be that an animal, be that a person, tend to repeat responses that lead to positive incomes and vice versa. Our example we used on Friday of the toddler throwing the tantrum, and then they get what they want, so then they next time will throw another tantrum, right? That is a basic learning principle, and that's a lot of what Skinner studied. He trained animals using this principle with much success. Later, his followers showed that it also works in humans. He even, this was, of course, we love it. This will maybe a great myth for someone to cover for their infographic. We love a good like urban legend in psychology. He built this like essentially what was be a bassinet today for his daughter when she was born, and like people were like, Skinner put his baby in the box, and they thought that she was like kept in there all the time. People love to misinterpret things. He stirred up controversy in the early 1970s when he published Beyond Freedom and Dignity. This was a popular press book, where rather than writing for an academic audience, he was trying to get like a New York Times bestseller, and it was. And this asserted that all behavior is governed by external stimuli. People are controlled only by their environments. And this is almost arguing the same thing as Freud, but from the opposite extreme. Again, you've got the 60s and the 70s, free love, and we're trying to get rights for everybody, right? And Skinner's like, nothing we do matters. It's all the environment. So no one has free will. Free will is an illusion. So people didn't take too well to that necessarily. And you know what? People bought the book. He made some money off of it because of the controversy. Sometimes any press is good press. So in the 1950s, we really saw a reaction not only just to Freud, but also to your Watsons, your Skinners. People said, okay, we gotta do better than these two extremes. It's not everything is unconscious, it's not everything is the environment. There's gotta be something in between, and we should really circle back around and focus on the person who's sitting right in front of us. So many people had a hard time believing that people are not the masters of their own fate. So the anti-Freud and anti-Skinner crowd formed a loose alliance that eventually became a new school of thought called humanism. Humanism was led by Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers in particular. And it focused on the unique qualities of humans, especially free will and the potential for human growth. It was a very optimistic view of human nature, as opposed to sort of these negative things that we saw couched in both psychoanalytic and behavioral theories. It really got people re-interested in the mental processes, and Rogers in particular translated this idea into a very popular type of therapy called humanistic or client-centered or person-centered therapy. And the idea is you focus on the individual, you offer them unconditional positive regard and support, and by so doing, you can start to eliminate any sort of negative ideas they've had about themselves from not getting that support other places in their lives. I'll talk about Maslow a little bit more later in the semester as well. He's the guy who came up with the hierarchy of needs, and his whole idea was you wanted to try to be like the best person you could be. So before World War II, we didn't really have clinical psychologists. If we had people doing therapy, they largely tended to be like Freud. They were physicians. I believe Freud would have been called a neurologist in today's age, who then picked up therapy. The really interesting thing about this is almost completely changed now. Not all, but the majority of the time now, if you go to see a psychiatrist, again, an MD, who's gone through med school, they are just going to do med management and not do therapy. Whereas in Freud's time, it was all psychiatrists who were doing therapy. So we saw these huge changes in what's expected. And part of what happened was World War II. World War II was devastating in a whole bunch of ways, right? Like, so not only did we have the horrors of what Nazi Germany was doing in the Holocaust, but also just giant numbers of young men, and in some cases young women, who were killed or injured or psychologically traumatized by this horrific war. So during World War II, many academic psychologists, so people like me who would be just like teaching at a university, doing research, they said, hey, we need you to help our servicemen. Help evaluate and treat these people. Part of the initial thing they wanted, and this started a little bit at the end of World War I, was let's evaluate whether people can be soldiers. And so they came up with psychological assessments for that. And the one thing I love that they did at this time is they came up with both one that required reading and one that did not require literacy. Because at that time they argued you don't have to be literate to be a good soldier. You don't have to be able to read. But we still need to test and make, basically we were trying to weed out people who were like sociopaths, right? Don't want to give those people a gun indiscriminately. And so psychologists were part of that. And then in particular, after the war, you had all these people coming back with what at that time they often just called shell shock, or they came up with other like sort of, I don't know, non-accurate terms about it, but it's what today we would call PTSD, right? They didn't have the clinical term for it until the 70s, really. And so they said we need more clinical psychologists. And so the Veterans Administration, the VA, started funding new training programs in clinical psychology. And as a result, in a few years, half of the new PhDs in psychology were clinical psychologists. And that really continues to this day, that clinical and counseling psychology continue to be the most popular PhDs and masters. So the VA also to this day is one of the biggest trainers and funders of psychologists. So when you do a PhD in clinical or counseling psychology, you do what's called an internship your last year. It's basically like a medical residency. And a large majority of those are at VAs. The one I did was a consortium between a VA and a medical college. So I was working at a VA and a medical college because the VA has the funding for things like this. VA also funds a lot of research in clinical psychology as well. I have a friend from grad school who this is what she does. So she does research within the DoD and the VA. She has some really cool research, like surfing with veterans as a way to cope with PTSD. Very cool stuff. So then around the 70s, people started to realize, okay, so we've got psychoanalytics still, we've got people who are like, everything is this trauma from your mom, right? Like these psychosexual thingies. We've got the behaviorists who are like, no, it's all just observable, it's all just the environment. We got the humanists who are like, we just want to help people, and all that's lovely, but what's actually going on up here? What's going on in the brain, in the mind? And so in the 60s and in the 70s in particular, people got really interested in what's called cognition. And cognition is studying thoughts and other mental processes. This says involved in acquiring knowledge, but it's really more than just that. It's also things like how we process things, how we memorize things. And so they took the now much improved scientific methods, again, it had been about a century at this point, right, since the first lab. And they said, let's use those methods to study internal mental events. Let's kind of go back to Wilhelm Wundt and what he was trying to do, and the structuralists and the functionalists. But let's do it really scientifically. Part of what came wrapped up in this was the biological perspective was also gaining popularity at that time. So the biological perspective said, we know the brain has a lot to do with how we think. We are developing tools that let us study the brain directly for medical purposes, right? Let's figure out if this person has a tumor or a head injury. What if we took that technology and used it to start studying the mind as well? So these two things were sort of married. So the dominance of behaviorist thought significantly decreased with the advent of cognitive psychology. Theorists here include like popular developmental theorists like Jean Piaget, who studied the development of how we think. Noam Chomsky studied the psychological underpinnings of language. And then Herbert Simon studied problem solving. And all of these folks paved a new path in psychology by using those scientific methods that were way beyond introspection to study these cognitive processes. The biology perspective had sort of started in the 1950s. James Olds at that time demonstrated that animals could be made to experience emotions such as pleasure or even anger, rage, by stimulation of the brain. And yeah, I should like be fully transparent. This literally meant like either inserting electrodes in the brain or having the brain open and like stimulating it in these animals. Use of animals in research in psychology has always been controversial. 30 years later, in the 1980s, Roger Sperry demonstrated that there are specialized functions in the left and the right hemispheres of the brain. and that those handle different types of mental tasks. Now, unfortunately, this has been taken too far. It's like there are some specialized functions, like language tends to be on your left, creativity, or left. Creativity is a little more on the right. But some people have taken this to the extreme and be like, you're left-brained or right-brained. It's like, no, you use both, and a lot of the functions are the same on both sides. Alrighty, so let's see. Now we only have about 6 minutes, so I'm gonna skip past these assignments. We'll do them on Wednesday, but I can start talking about the areas of psychological research now. Now the field has really exploded. There are lots of different facets of this. So what we were just talking about, biological psychology has become physiological psychology. So this is the study of how our brain affects our behavior directly. So sort of the physiology of behavior. It also studies the nervous system and the hormones. Psychophysiology looks at physical reactions like heart rate, skin conductance. Comparative psychology is studying animals and comparing them to humans and vice versa. Behavioral analysis is the effects of the environment on behavior, learning, motivation. Behavioral genetic is just what it sounds like. Are there things in our genetic code that program how we're going to act? We just talked about cognitive psychology. This has only become more advanced ways of looking at mental processes and complex behaviors like attention or memory. We have a cognitive psychologist in our department. That's Dr. Robert Ariel, who's on sabbatical this semester. Experimental neuropsychology looks at brain mechanisms responsible for the cognitive processes. So in particular, they study people who have sustained brain trauma in some way, whether that's acquired or something they've had since birth. Developmental psychology looks at development across the lifespan. So we actually have 2 developmental psychologists in our department. We have Dr. Martorell, who studies children and adolescents. And then our new psychologist, Dr. Harrington, studies adults and aging. Social psychology is the effects of people on people, how we influence each other. Personality psychology are individual differences in temperament, and I should say we have a social psychologist, Dr. Jackson. Personality psychology is individual differences in behavior and temperament. Cross-cultural looks at the impact of culture on how we behave. And then I'm a clinical psychologist and we study mental disorders and issues of adjustment. All right, so we'll end there today. And like I said, on Wednesday, we will do 2 group activities. So to kind of explore this a little more.